Afsaneh, let me start with you. You've dealt a lot with China.
Yes.
Do we trust the numbers? Because this week China revised upward the number of cases substantially from what we thought it was.
I think as with all other cases in China, just like the GDP numbers and other data that we have looked at, people who have been watching China did not necessarily believe the data that they were seeing. There was a question mark as to whether there was a shortage of kits to test people or whether the government was actually limiting the number of kits. And of course, we just had the revision in terms of the kind of testing you need to make sure we knew if somebody had the virus or not. I think the government has known all along since the first case in December that this is a bigger problem, but they've tried to manage the news just like they do with other data. And I think it has now created a major PR problem for the leader and his party.
A major PR problem, Steve, but it is also a major problem for investors, for Jay Powell for that matter, trying to get your arms around projecting what is going to happen. You have to know where you are. If we don't trust the numbers, how do we know where we are?
Well, we don't, and I think Jay Powell was appropriately candid about that, and all we can do is watch and wait and see how the data unfolds. I think there is a perception in the market, and Afsaneh certainly knows more about the actual facts around this. There's a perception in the market that this is not going to be an earth-shaking event from an economic point of view, and that we may even be on the downward side of the curve in terms of the number of cases and so on and so forth.
But is it possible the market's getting too eager to call this a V rather than a U or even an L?
Well, I think there's a lot of things going on in the market, which we can talk about whenever you want, not just the coronavirus as to why the market moves the way it moves. But if you go back and look at the experience around SARS, it was a V, basically, in the market. Mm-hmm. It went down, it turned around, it went back up again. And completely different set of facts, but the same thing happened in March of 2009, when the market looked like it was collapsing, and then suddenly it became a V. So I think there are a number of investors who look at this and want to be careful they don't run for the exits just as the party's resuming.
Is SARS right? Is that the right analog?
I think it's a really important analog, even though, at that point, obviously, the size of the economy in China was much smaller. The interactions and sort of the global nature of China's exports was different. But I think what Steve said is really important in the sense that with what's going on in China, if you look at the actual numbers, markets are not down that much.
Yes.
Not the way we would have expected them to be. The other thing, which is very interesting, is if you look inside the numbers, technology stocks, are doing well. Anything related to the internet where people are using the systems to buy goods and get things delivered are doing well. Biologics and the health sector are up like 8, 9, 10%, depending on which you're looking at. So within a market that is very, very stressed, in a market where people, less than 10% of the labor in many parts of the provinces, larger provinces, are coming to work, it's interesting and, frankly, a little surprising that the Chinese market itself has not been affected as much as, let's say, the total market in Indonesia or some other neighboring countries.
So whether the the coronavirus does cause a downturn or not, Jay Powell was asked about what tools he had to address a downturn, and he basically said, don't count on monetary policy, look to fiscal.
The current low interest rate environment also means that it would be important for fiscal policy to help support the economy if it weakens. Putting the federal budget on a sustainable path when the economy is strong would help ensure that policymakers have the space to use fiscal policy to assist in stabilizing the economy during a downturn. A more sustainable federal budget could also support the economy's growth over the long term.
So, Steve, it strikes me we got a budget proposal out of the Trump administration this week, and it certainly had stimulus in it. We have deficits going up to $30 trillion eventually. I'm not sure that Mr. Powell would call that sustainable.
No, I think what the chairman was saying in Fed speak was that he was not happy with the Trump budget. Not so much their proposals as their policies. In other words, it's a little bit like watch what he does, not what he says. They put out a budget document that does theoretically provide for balance, and I think it's 2035 or something like that. But everything they've done since they came into office was to massive tax cuts, massive spending, increase in concert with the Democrats, in fairness. And so basically you've had more than a doubling in the budget deficit from less than $500 billion to $1 trillion just because of that. So I think what Powell is saying is there is not much space on the monetary side. We've talked about this before. We can talk about it again. But he's also saying at the moment there isn't necessarily that we haven't made enough space on the fiscal side either because $1 trillion deficit's big enough by itself.
But Afsaneh, the United States is not alone in this regard. I mean, austerity has gone by the wayside. We had the Chancellor of the Exchequer step down this week in the UK. The pound went up because they think, well, maybe Boris Johnson can spend more money.
Exactly. It seems like every world leader is taking a page out of the Chinese leaders. And it started in China, where deficit spending was not a problem. The U.S. has definitely been on a rampage on that front. But Europe, with Mrs. Merkel also, not just in the UK, what we saw today with the pound going up, but Mrs. Merkel in her more recent interviews has been quite interested in looking at infrastructure, looking at the green economy now being sources of stimulus.
Okay, but let's put this in perspective.
Yes.
Mrs. Merkel being interested in stimulus
Yes.
from where she is starting.
On a relative basis.
Yes,
On
exactly.
a relative basis.
And China,
Yes.
we all
Agreed.
talk about the problems in China.
Agreed.
I would probably trade their balance sheet for our balance sheet
Right.
if I wanted to pick the best balance sheet.